nuclear scare scam with Galen Winsor. Here to introduce Mr. Winsor is Pastor Ben Williams. Pastor Williams.
I'm pleased to have as our guest Mr. Galen Winsor from Richland, Washington. I first heard of Galen from a tape that somebody gave to me some months ago, and I found his story to be absolutely fascinating. His story is unique, to say the least. Galen has been in 77 different cities in the last 2 years lecturing on the subject of nuclear energy. The majority of his life, the last 35 years, he spent processing plutonium from nuclear reactor sites. He has worked in the Manhattan Project facilities in Hanford, Washington, Oak Ridge National Laboratories and Nuclear Plant in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, General Electric's Midwest Fuel Recovery Plant in Morris, Illinois, General Electric's Fuel Fabrication Facility in San Jose, California, and Wilmington, North Carolina. And he's worked in every major reactor decommissioning project around this nation up to this present time. His major work in these projects has been the analytical process inventory control, which means that he was responsible for measuring and controlling the nuclear fuel inventory for these projects. Galen Winsor has few peers in the world in this area of expertise. And those few peers admittedly know and agree with the things that you'll be hearing on this tape. However, except for 2 or 3 of these experts, they've all chosen to remain silent for reasons which they only know, leaving this man then the burden of leading this lonely battle of exposing what we call the nuclear scare scam. He's without question one of the world's foremost authorities in nuclear radiation measurement, and he's recognized by members of the Atomic Energy Commissions of all the major nations of the free world. Mr. Galen Winsor. God bless you.
Thank you, Ben. We've been considering today how best to approach this subject so that you would feel comfortable with where I am. And we thought it might be appropriate to start with how I got involved in this game. Now, in 1945, I was a Navy radioman out in the Pacific on a destroyer aimed for Japan. We had a one-way ticket. That's all you get, just one way. So, as we were becoming proficient at our business of fighting war, the Manhattan Project caught up with us and did a job. Now, the weapon that was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan in August 6, 1945 was a U-235, fully enriched U-235 weapon, where the material was separated and purified in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The one that was dropped August 9th on Nagasaki was a plutonium weapon made at Hanford. But to those of us out in the Pacific, it was quite interesting. It had a ticket on it that says, "You get to go home." I was impressed. Now, I was stuck out on Guam after the hostilities quit and was running a radio broadcast that communicated with 4,500 ships west of Pearl Harbor. Quite a few to listen to every dot and dash that I made. So I was used to having people listen to me. They couldn't see me, but they could sure hear me. I had all of the good messages that were to come to them. Fleet movements to Red Cross messages. They came along one day and says, "We'd like to have radiomen to go down to Eniwetok for the atomic bomb tests." Not me. No way. I want to go home. So they went through and they took every 3rd radioman to go to Eniwetok. I didn't go. They let me come home. But I wanted to go home. I had a driving need within me that says, hey, that big firecracker, I want to know how it works. I want to know everything about how it works. So, back to the ranch in Nevada where I grew up and stacked hay all summer, gained back the 40 pounds that I'd lost out there in the islands. Into Brigham Young University in the fall of '46 in chemistry classes. Dr. Joseph Nichols could make an old farm kid like me love chemistry. I hadn't had any chemistry in high school, but the way Joe Nichols taught it, I wanted to know. So chemistry it was. And some neat guys like Carl Eyring taught me physics. And along in '47, I ran across a cute blonde from Richland, Washington. Now, this girl had been telephone operator for General Leslie Groves and Dr. Enrico Fermi on the Manhattan Project. She got to put through the calls to Franklin Delano Roosevelt for these guys, so she talked personally to FDR. And she told me some of the stories like you've never heard. She says, oh, in those canyons, great things are done. This cowboy from Nevada couldn't even imagine what she was talking about. Well, in 1947, after we were married, I ran until she caught me. But I wasn't going to get married anyway. I wanted to get my education. I had to get on with this thing. And so we went to Richland, Washington for the first time in September of 1947. I saw that those buildings she was talking about were there. 1,000 feet long, 11 stories high, 5 of them below ground. Tremendous things. And people all over. Camp Hanford in those days was a whole army camp just there to secure that place, to provide security. Thousands of soldiers. You move around out in the desert and up out of a foxhole would pop a soldier with a gun in his hand. There wasn't any horsing around. It was all business. Back to school. In 1950, I applied for a job up there before I had graduated, and they were in such bad need of chemists, I had a job before I had my degree. And so the last year of my chemistry, mostly English, I did on a bus, riding 25 miles to work in the morning and 25 miles back at night. And I did advanced grammar and business writing and all of those things on that bus. But in September 1950, I got into this thing called plutonium processing when we did it barehanded, without instruments, without coveralls. We had some of the most peculiar acid burns in some of the shirts. And I found one of those the other day. It's got acid burns all up the front of it. Plutonium on it, too. Amazing. That was normal operation in those days. We ran those facilities, and we ran them so well that by 1965, we had separated enough plutonium when it only existed in the parent uranium matrix to a half of a single weight percent, 0.005 weight fraction of plutonium maximum in that fuel. And we processed enough tons of uranium to recover enough plutonium by 1965 to meet the weapons needs of this country 10 times over for the foreseeable future. Now we're talking about a massive amount of work. Hands-on, do it type thing. And there was a couple thousand of us, and we were just happy as could be, just working like mad, making those plants run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in a community that ran on shift work, ABCD shift. The whole community that way. A wartime community, people dedicated to doing a job, and we were doing it, and we did it well. No pretense. Oh, yes, there were. Out in the reactor began to sneak in people who wanted a radiation monitor behind every reactor operator. Why? We know how to make these things run. When we got a metal fuel element stuck and it fell down on the trampoline back of the reactor, we'd go in with our feet and kick it off into the pool, smoking, burning. If you didn't have an instrument, you didn't know it was too hot, so you just went in and kicked it. Finally, along came a rule maker that says, thou shalt not do that. You'll get burned. Oh, I didn't get burned when I did it last week. But you exceeded the limit. Well, where did this limit come from? Turns out that in 1934, the International Commission on Radiation Protection fabricated a limit for X-rays. It was no longer permissible to be burned by them, erythema, reddening of the skin. You now had to keep a limit called 0.2 of an hour per day. How much is that? Well, you've got to have one of these Beckman instruments to read it, and you have to keep time of exposure. You know, there are 4 requirements on this thing: the size of the source, therefore the strength of the source, the distance from the source, the time of exposure, and the intervening shielding to keep from getting burned. Oh, fine. We've been doing this thing for years now, and we've never been burned. Why have we got these rules? And they says, yours is not to ask questions, yours is to do and die. Don't you ask questions. If you do, you might disappear. Those who broke the rules didn't appear the next day. Military rule? Oh, yes. Absolute. What was your appeal? And people you were working with one day, when they weren't there the next day, you didn't go inquire why. You were just grateful you still had your work to do, and you kept right on doing it. Now, this is in the United States of America. Well, in 1960, we found out that the materials that we were working with, the thing that we called high-level waste, that if you waited 3 years, these million-gallon tanks that high-level waste went into boiled off 15,000 gallons of water a day. Fairly hot? Oh, yes. This material that if it ever broke a line would seal itself off in the ground within a foot, make its own glass. It wasn't going to go anyplace. We did that a time or two, accidentally, of course. And so we started packaging this cesium-137 in casks in railroad cars like that and shipping it to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And they'd take it out and make it into a barium titanate and press it into a pellet, and those things were so hot that they actually glowed in the dark from the infrared heat. Now, thermo-ionic conversions came along at this time, so you hooked these little heat sources up to thermionic converters and you took electricity out this side, no moving parts. These things went into the SNAP program. And these early SNAP power generators are what powered the underwater transmitters for our nuclear navy. We've got a regular road map under the sea. All you got to do is have an instrument that knows how to find it, and then you've got eyes on a submarine. You didn't know that, did you? The power from it came from this material that they now call waste. We processed that stuff and packaged it outside at Hanford. Well, we had rules that said 3R per year is your allowable exposure, that amount of gamma energy that will expose a film pack. But that was for the people that didn't know. We weren't about to follow those rules. We just went ahead and did the job. They send around an investigation slip that says your dosimeter was overexposed 2 weeks ago. What did you do? And they had a cute little form on it that says accidentally exposed to light, and that was the one I always used to check. Because it's the same amount of light. You know, if you get gamma through the film pack, it's the same amount of light as you get when you click the lens on a camera. They wanted to limit us to that. And one day we looked up, and they had. They had limited us to that amount of exposure. Then the fun part of the game begins. You say, who limited us to that? Are they powerful? Yeah, they control the purse strings. They live by the golden rule. Them that's got the gold makes the rules. If you like your work, you keep the rules. If you don't keep the rules, you disappear. Sure enough, some of us disappeared. Some of my friends gone. Where'd they go? I don't know. Well, 2 years ago, I started traveling for American Opinion Speakers Bureau, and one of the documents that they had was Major Jordan's diary. A story of shipping the technology and the material that was developed at Hanford in 1944 directly to Russia on U.S. Air Force planes out through Great Falls, Montana, Fairbanks, Alaska, under the auspices of one Harry Hopkins, and with the at least tacit approval of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now what are you going to do? That thing that we had been doing and feeling so good about had been shared at no expense with Russia. You go back and you check the record and you find Russia did not develop their own nuclear atomic weapon until 1949, even when we supplied them the material and the knowledge. 4 years after we touched them off at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We weren't happy with that. We were just happy doing our job. Well, in 1965, General Electric was ready to leave Hanford. I'd worked for General Electric for that 15 years, and they took me out to California, San Jose, and we had in mind to design and build this nuclear fuel reprocessing plant at Morris, Illinois. They told me they were going to build it at San Luis Obispo. That's how they got me away from Hanford. But that was just to get me away from Hanford. I got to design the sampling analytical system for this plant. The sample cell was the hydraulic heart of this place. I got to dictate where they put the columns, how high the columns were in relation to my sample cell. One man standing in front of a lead glass window could sample any liquid stream in that whole plant. It took crews of men at Hanford to do the same thing. I wasn't happy with that, so I built an efficient system. I got to design that. I got to build it. Conceptual design, detailed design, build it, operationally test it. And in 1973, they says, forget it, friends, you don't get to run it. We had 170 tons, metric tons of spent fuel stored in the basin. And the then President of the United States, do you remember who it was? Jerry Ford. Says, friends, no way, you don't get to run it. That's when I started to kick over the traces. Up to that point of time, I thoroughly enjoyed my work. I had no limitations, practical limitations. I had all the money to spend. I was in charge of the design effort. I built it the way that I wanted to because it was technically correct. All I had to do was check with engineers and make sure that it was right. And all of a sudden I was told, you must reduce your limits of exposure by a factor of 10. I says, I won't do it. First thing you know, you got the word that says, oh, yes, you will. And I says, no way. Well, that's when the rebel, Galen Winsor, started to show up. And when I found out that by management conference I couldn't get to these guys, I figured out another way. Now, in this plant is a beautiful pool. It's got, and a place to store spent fuel bundles till it won't stop. 660,000 gallons of water, demineralized, just as clear and pretty as it can be. Heated to 100 degrees Fahrenheit when the outside temperatures are a minus 20, wind chill factors down to a minus 60, and I found out that I could swim in that rascal. You turn off the lights at night and it had a light blue Cherenkov effect. And this kid from Nevada that never could pass up a warm swimming hole used to go swimming in that pool. There wasn't anybody that had the nerve to swim with me, but since I was manager of safety and analytical services at this plant, it was mine to use. Oh boy. I found out that I could do that. I showed some financial types one time that I could stir that pool with my bare hand and check out through the same radiation monitors they did without triggering it. GE didn't like it. I got a letter from him that says, "Thou shalt not tell financial types that you can swim in the pool, that you can stir it with your hand, because if they find that out, they will steal the inventory. They will know that the inventory can be stolen." Oh, is that a valuable inventory? The same material that's labeled high-level waste by our current government, our current Congress. Now, plutonium is an interesting chemical element. It is created in a nuclear reactor. The Manhattan Project built 8 of these reactors at Hanford. The first one took 12 months from sagebrush to nuclear steam to build, and it had never been done in that size before. How could they do that? Why did they do it? To create this element called plutonium. Plutonium has been assessed as being the most hazardous material on Earth. Now, from the standpoint that you can make an atomic weapon out of it, yes, it is quite hazardous, because a piece of it that big, 2.5 kilograms, that's only 5 pounds, is the force that delivered 20,000 tons of TNT equivalent over Nagasaki. Indeed, it is hazardous. The one over Hiroshima that had fully enriched U-235 in it was 5 times as big. So plutonium is more dangerous than U-235, is it not? By a factor of 5. It takes 5 times as much U-235 as it does plutonium. Therefore, it is the most hazardous thing. Enter the great pretenders. They said that 5 grams of plutonium, properly distributed over the face of the Earth, would kill everybody on Earth. Now, if you can only get one 20-kiloton weapon to go on 2,500 grams, how's 5 grams going to kill everybody on Earth? Early on, I had a fear that said, if there is this much fissile material, that can undergo a chain reaction, we called it in the beginning, then if you set a match to it, all the fissile material in the world is just going to keep right on going. Totally unfounded fear. It turns out that when you're in this business of recovering plutonium, like we recovered so much of it at Hanford, we found out that if you have it in a solution where it's less than 5% plutonium, it won't go critical any way that you kick it. And when you get it to 100% plutonium, you better be careful. Because if you put it in more than a 5-inch diameter cylinder, you're playing with fire. You can undergo what is known as an uncontrolled criticality, accidental criticality. The air turns blue. If the cylinder is sealed, it will explode from steam pressure. And that steam pressure builds up in a millisecond, which is about that long. No, you don't horse with it. And then you find out that those 8-foot thick shielding walls on those canyons were put there because they didn't know how much was a critical mass. They says, if we make a mistake, we don't want to die, so we will provide the shielding. And so this shielding thing started for no other reason than they didn't know what was a critical mass. Well, through the years, we got pretty good at telling what a critical mass was. And I have worked in a plant where I had half a critical mass in this hand, barehanded, dressed in street clothes, half in this hand, wearing a lab coat, and I'd put this half in a pocket on this side and this half in a pocket on this side and walk down the hall. If those two ever got together, there would be a blue flash. They never got together because I was in between them. And we do that every day. And each half had to meet definite dimension characteristics. And so we'd take them down and pass them one half at a time, and they'd measure it and say, yeah, that one will pass. And then we'd pass them the other half, and that one will pass too. But they were carefully put in separate bird cages so they couldn't get together accidentally. Well, those of us who worked with it enjoyed it. We knew what we were doing. We worked at it.